Hey guys, good morning from Hunan province. I drove here from Shenzhen yesterday, took about 12 hours, and I'm on a road trip across the country. Gonna take the kids to see some snow. I might upload a video about the road trip later, but yeah, no, it's about 6 a.m. in the morning here, nice and chilly. Around the same time yesterday in Shenzhen, in this time of the morning, it's about 23 degrees, but here we're sitting at about 6 degrees, so it's nice and chilly. I only got about 4 hours sleep last night for some reason, so looks like my dark circles are even darker than they usually are. I have I have a name that I coined that some of the locals here liked, which I called myself Jinko Shongmao, imported panda. Some of the locals really like that. But onto the main point. The reason I wanted to make this video was this morning I saw that the video about the $30 million apartment in Shenzhen's really getting some traction. So I wanted to do a quick follow-up video on that because there was actually some relevant, interesting news that came out regarding property also at the same time. And it was interesting reading through the comments. A lot of it echoed what I suspected at the beginning of my last video, which was some people would just find it not very special at all. The layout leaves a lot to be desired, but obviously the view is the exception. A lot of people agreed that the view was really nice. But the whole purpose of that video is to show you how outrageously priced the properties are in Shenzhen. So you get a feel for how expensive of a city Shenzhen is. And the one comment I saw a lot of was like, wow, $30 million, I could get this in this town for this much money, or this city. And that's kind of a useless comparison. I mean, $30 million, I could probably buy half of this town with it. And so again, it was just to show you a reference about how expensive Shenzhen is. And one of the things you might be tempted to do also, though, is to think that that's representative of a massive wealth gap problem in China. And while it is true, I'm just trying to stay in this hall here because there's not much light outside. I thought I'd come out and there'd be more daylight at this time, so I'm just staying in this little hallway here. But anyways, back to that thought. Even though the difference between the lowest end and the highest end in China and in Shenzhen is very extreme, you might be surprised to learn that overall the wealth gap in China has been managed quite well. There's a measurement called the Gini coefficient that is used to measure the income inequality in various societies. And over the last 10 years in China, it has dropped substantially. The last 2 or 3 years, there was a little bit of an uptick, but still, actually, overall, it's lower than the US. And I think China has an appreciation for the need to stay on top of something like this. You know, when I was in the car yesterday on the way here, I binged on a podcast called Hidden Brain. And there was one episode about income inequality, saying, why do I not feel rich enough? And it was really interesting because they showed how in a society, in a poor society, poverty is one of the main indicators that's going to determine your crime rate in your city. And but what happens is once a society gets developed past a certain point, when everybody gets to a point more or less that they have what they need, relatively speaking, all of a sudden it changes to something else. The indicator all of a sudden becomes the income inequality, the wealth gap. And it was really interesting to show how they highlighted it, even to the point where they said that, they studied instances of air rage, and, planes that had a first-class cabin had higher instances of air rage, particularly when the passengers in economy needed to walk past the first-class cabin with everybody nicely seated in their massive seats who got to board the plane first. And then they even went one step further and showed that if the plane still had first class, but the economy passengers boarded from the back, that there would be instantly less instances or likelihood of air rage. So that was quite interesting. And another way that they kind of highlighted that was they said in the US, the middle class population, more or less, they're not more poor and their quality of living has not gone down over the past 100 years, but the discontent and the feeling of income inequality has gone up massively. And the one thing that has happened is the upper 1% or the upper tier of society has soared so much higher than them, and the difference is so big that that is actually what becomes a source of discontent. So I have a feeling that China appreciates that, and they know that they've got to stay on top of stuff like this. And the story that came out, actually, coincidentally, the exact same day that I filmed that video of the apartment in Shenzhen, there was a story that came out that in Shenzhen, in another neighborhood, I think it was in Luohu or Futian, the government found that there was a group of owners in that building who got together and decided that they were going to price fix their apartments, and that they weren't going to sell for less than, I believe it was 57,000 RMB per square meter. And the government cracked down on it. They removed all of their listings. I don't know if there were any other punishments also, but it goes to show that this is something of value to the government, that they want to stamp out this kind of price fixing, make sure that income inequality stays in check, and that there aren't unnecessary barriers for people who are trying to work their way up. So I think that's one important thing to keep in mind when you look at that, because that apartment was obviously a show of excess, extreme excess, beyond what most people think is even reasonable. Now, yeah, in terms of the pricing, what's interesting is I actually wanted to buy, I was looking at buying an apartment in 2007 before I arrived in Shenzhen, in the outskirts. And then in 2010, I was looking at the prices again. And even then, I said to myself, I don't get these prices. These prices are so expensive. And man, do I regret that. Because if I did buy then, I mean, the price has gone up many times since then. I would have never imagined. So, but you can start to understand that if even then I was having a difficult time comprehending the prices then, you can imagine what I'm thinking now. And to be honest, I mean, that wasn't the only reason I didn't want to buy. The other concern I had was, what kind of legal rights do I have here? What kind of rights do any property owners have here if something goes wrong? And my perception in the beginning was that it would be really low. But there are a few things that happened throughout my 11 years in China that kind of changed my position or my theory on that. There was actually even a couple months ago there was some pictures shared on the internet of a building, I think it was in Hangzhou, that the foundation had cracked and all of the buildings had just like all of a sudden leaned, and they were just, they're as good as done. I think you've got to demolish those buildings now. And that got shared a lot on social media, but the follow-up story actually didn't get shared. And the follow-up story was that within a few days, the government, I believe it was the government or the developer, they said that they were going to pay the owners of those apartments 3 times the value of their property, plus they received moving expenses of, there's a little dog there. They're going to receive moving expenses of about 500 renminbi a day, or living expenses during the time that they don't have a home. And the 3x payout, I think it was going to be paid out over a year period. There was a period of time. And people have such confidence in that being true and that that's going to happen that some people who wanted the money quicker, they sold the deed to their property, this destroyed property, to somebody else who was willing to wait so that they could get a little bit less but quicker. So I think, and if you contrast that to somewhere like Sydney, I remember seeing a story in Sydney of the Opal Towers in the city, where the foundation cracked, or you started hearing cracking noises, and it looked like a terrible story where people were talking about losing their life savings, and now they've got pillars running through their living rooms. I think they received some compensation of some sort, but it wasn't a few days thing, and it was an incredible battle, and I think some people have lost out big time in this property. So in some ways, my confidence of owning a property here in that regard has gone up. Now, obviously, there still is the issue of the leases here. So the leases are Like, what are they? They're 70 years for residential properties and 40 or 50 years for commercial properties. And actually, the Shenzhen Bay, the apartments I took you to visit, those are classified as commercial properties. So I'm pretty sure that actually the lease on those super expensive apartments are 40 or 50 years also. And so the question is, what happens after that? And I think most people here have a confidence that the government's not going to leave you high and dry here. That would cause a pretty unhappy population. And contrary to popular belief, they do try hard to keep everybody happy here. And actually, in some ways, I think as a government that wasn't directly elected by the people per se, has even more accountability to show the people that they're doing the right thing. And that's a topic I actually want to get into in another video, because there's some interesting things to mention on that. But it still is a risk, right? It still is a risk. What does happen? You're putting your trust in the government here. And the same is true for a lot of investments in life. But that was something that caused a level of discomfort also. And so where was I? Yeah, so the leases, 50 or 40 years to 70 years. I'm going to be a little bit discombobulated here because it's so early. But yeah, going back to the wealth gap item for a minute, the one thing to keep in mind is that, sure, it is actually really expensive in Shenzhen to own property, and it's out of reach for a lot of people. But from a rental point of view, there's a lot of cheap rental options, particularly in these apartments, which are called, they're called village apartments. They're not really villages, but they're classified as village property within the city, within Shenzhen city, in really good locations. And how a lot of these came to be, you've got buildings on these properties, which are usually 6 floors or less. Some of them are much taller. A lot of them don't have elevators. I think they're pretty shoddy construction, or low quality construction. I mean, I shouldn't say shoddy construction. They're still standing after many decades. But the way they came to be was actually these villagers in Shenzhen, when they didn't have as much money, they weren't as rich as they are now. You had these Hong Kong guys coming over, and they would give money to these villagers to build a building on top of their land if they were in a good position. And in exchange, the Hong Kong owners would get a few floors. Maybe they'd get the ground floor commercial shops also to rent out to people. And then in turn, the villager would have somewhere to live inside, and they'd get a few floors also that they could rent out to people and earn an income from. So it's an interesting dynamic. And for those people, to sell those properties, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to really legally change those deeds over to somebody who's not a Shenzhen local. And but for the people who are renting in those, if there are workers in Shenzhen, and if they aren't already provided dormitories by the companies that they work for, which is common. I mean, I provide dorms for all of my staff in my bar. That's a very common thing. But if they do have to rent on their own, that would be a good choice for them. And they don't mind as much, because their purpose in Shenzhen, for a lot of them, is to make as much money as they can in Shenzhen. They're coming to a wealthy city, and then take that money back to their hometown and buy a property, which is going to be many times cheaper, and then maybe open up a business at home also. So it creates an interesting dynamic that actually works well for a lot of people here. And what else do I want to cover? There's a few other really interesting things that came up. I'll share an interesting story. This one was a little bit random. I don't know how to fit this one in. Maybe it goes into the category of the government really paying attention to the needs of the people in terms of property rights. There's this one story. There's parts of it I can't verify, and there's parts of it that I know are true. So the one part I know that's true is that there's a building in Shenzhen, not too far from where I am, and there are the people were really unhappy with the management office. And so the management office, there were a lot of people complaining. They got together in a WeChat group, and there was especially one particular lady who was very, very vocal and very aggressive. And what happened was, there was one day she was outside and she got assaulted. That's the part I'm not sure is true. But I do know that people attributed that, when they were spreading that rumor, or whether it was true, they attributed it to her being one of the more vocal people in this group trying to overthrow this management office. And so going back to the part that I do know is true, because I saw them myself outside, I was like, what the heck is going on? within 2 or 3 days of that incident, the whole building was surrounded by SWAT teams, put like more police than I've ever seen in one place in Shenzhen, and they forcefully removed the management from the management office, and they installed a new company. Not a government company, it's a private company, and it was the private company that that group was actually pushing for to come in. And so there was a swift response to that if it was true. Obviously there's some concerns there's some questions to be asked about whether an assault like this really happened in China. What are the implications of that in terms of safety in China, although it's a rare story. But from a government point of view, it looks like they really paid attention to this issue once it got big enough. And I actually thought that wouldn't happen as well, for them to switch out to this management company. When I knew that they were doing this fight, having this fight to change to this new company, I thought there's no way that's going to happen, because the management office that was in place was actually the same company as the builder of the building. And so I thought it would be really difficult to separate the two. But now, yeah, the builder is one company, and they still have responsibilities to the building in a certain sense, to a certain degree. And now the management office is there too, who collects the management fees for the building and takes care of the property. They're doing a pretty good job. I know the building really well. So that's just an interesting kind of side note. But I'm sure there were a few other things I wanted to mention. What I'm going to do actually is I'm going to make some more videos on properties in China. And oh yeah, I remember. Sorry, I'm all over the place. Give me some allowance because it's quite early here. One other thing I wanted to mention was actually the ownership prices and rental prices are really out of whack in China. This is one of the reasons actually I moved away from buying a property also. In a lot of Western countries, there's generally a guide, like unofficially, that you can calculate, where you say, okay, 4 or 5 years worth of rent will equal 20 to 25% of the property value. And that's generally true. I don't know if the numbers are exactly accurate, but there's a way to measure it. And I remember comparing it to China and saying that this is really out of whack. I mean, the rental prices are way more attractive than the ownership prices. And I even know a Taiwanese guy who owns a publicly listed electronics company. It's a massive company, and he's not in need of money. I mean, I know him from, there's I don't know if it's still around, there's this high-end like whiskey wine bar, and they have like a jazz band that plays, and when he goes there, he buys almost everybody in the bar drinks, he buys bottles of whiskey for the band. I mean, he's not in need of money, and he didn't buy a property. He says, it doesn't make sense. He says, if you look at the rental prices and the ownership prices, why would I buy a property? I'd rather take that money and invest it in something else. And it kind of reminds me of, I think it was Rich Dad, Poor Dad, the book where the author mentioned something along the lines of when he was buying properties, the only properties he bought were the ones that he would rent out, and the one that he lived in himself was actually a rental. And so it takes a certain mindset to be able to wrap your mind around that. I'm not sure if that was the book, but I remember reading that about somebody's philosophy on property ownership. Excuse me, but it's going to be a lot harder for people here to accept that, because there's an obsession with property ownership here. And as long as that's in place, it is going to be out of whack for a while, and this is going to be the reality of prices and the way things are priced out here. There may be an adjustment coming. There may be a property price adjustment coming too, but mind you, I've been saying that since 2010. I said these prices have to come down, and I've been wrong. But to wrap this up, because I think, what am I at? Geez, I'm almost at 20 minutes. So to wrap this up, what I'm going to do is I actually want to look for an opportunity to take you on a tour of some of those village apartments that I was talking about earlier on, the cheaper apartments, the lowest of the low in Shenzhen. Because I also don't want you guys to get the idea, I'm taking you on tours of $30 million apartments. I'm talking to you about CEOs that I know who own publicly listed companies. I don't want you to think that I'm in some sort of a bubble where I'm seeing China and Shenzhen through the lens of these kinds of upper ends of society. I know people from all walks of life across the entire spectrum. Even the lady on the street who's nearby my bar, who goes around and purchases plastic bottles to resell, and they seem pretty poor. I know everything about her. I know where her hometown is. I know how many kids she has, and I'm friends with people from all walks of life. And so I want to show you a little bit more about the whole range so you can kind of make up your mind for yourself, and also in terms of what's going on. And yeah, so if you're looking forward to something like that and you're not already subscribed, make sure you subscribe. And I've got a lot more China content stuff coming, just about my, you know, the ordinary things in life here, are things that I've noticed, or differences compared to the West. I think there's really endless amounts of interesting things to talk about here, especially when you're networked with the people here and you're not just coming here and applying your Western way of thinking. I mean, even the most simple things like, going back to property for a second, I remember when I was talking to my wife, before she was my wife, about property ownership, and I was like kind of saying like, wow, you guys are buying properties here and you've only got a 70-year lease, you don't really own the property. Whoa, we got the lights came out. I'm gonna have to go over here. And so I wonder if somebody's sleeping here and I've disturbed them and they've shut the lights off on me. There's that possibility. But one of the things, when she started asking me about how property ownership works in Canada, I don't know how we got onto the topic about property taxes. And she said to me, she said, wait, hold on a second. You have to pay a property tax every year. I said, yeah. And she says, well, what happens if you don't pay it? And I said, well, maybe you can have your property taken away. And then she says to me, you don't really own your property. You're just renting it from the government. And obviously that's a very simplistic way of looking at it. But, there's so many different ways that you can look at things. And I know there's a lot of people who have come to China and they've made YouTube videos, but they're still viewing things from their own perspective. And they haven't really meaningfully, oh, look at that, a horse. They haven't meaningfully engaged with the people here to really change their framework of how they're approaching the things that they're observing here. Anyways, you know what? It's dark here. You can't really see me anymore. And as I said, there's more stuff coming, but I wanted to do a quick, kind of almost like a part 2 of that video. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to finish off this video with a shot of this little town here that I took last night, just over the lake. It's quite interesting. So until next time, guys, take care. And Merry Christmas. This is Christmas Day that I'm filming this. I'll see you guys next time.